友達様がいるだにも
The interpreter crumpled to the ground with a thud. This was the first time Ito had ever killed someone with his own hands.
大変な場所に噛みついたもこいだ
He'd spent his entire life weaving a delusion that he was a hero too. Yet the only halfway decent thing he'd ever done was in the final 5 seconds of his life. Yuxiu watched the interpreter die to protect her, overcome with grief. But Kurishima wouldn't let her mourn. He dragged her roughly toward the bedroom and threw her onto the bed. As he knelt down to inspect the newly discovered cellar entrance, he failed to sense the danger creeping up behind him. Ito's rage had reached its boiling point. He seized his gun and pressed on, demanding to know where the negatives were hidden.
弟弟どこだ在这里
Ito screamed, clutching his face, and staggered, propping himself up on the table. Seizing the opportunity, Yuxiu sprang into action. The photo studio was finally safe, for the moment. Kurishima lay sprawled in a pool of blood, felled by an axe to the head. Yuxiu draped a headscarf over the dead interpreter's body. As she straightened his clothes, she found 2 exit passes tucked in his pocket.
他老婆孩子的呀，把照片撕了，快！
我不用他老婆孩子们
全家人帮日本人做事，哎，他早就托人灌造过了，没得死吧？
Old Jin pulled out a photo of himself and his family. He credited the interpreter and Ito for helping his wife and daughter escape. Utterly unaware that they had already been murdered, he begged Yuxiu and Ah Chang to take his son with them when they left. Ah Chang hesitated, saying his face was covered in wounds. If the Japanese soldiers spotted him, they'd never make it through the checkpoint. He insisted that Old Jin and Yuxiu take the child and flee first.
说了把照相馆传给我，都舍不得了，师傅。
Old Jin hugged Ah Chang tightly, tears streaming down his face in gratitude. Deep down, they weren't sure if anyone was looking after the interpreter's wife and child. But in the fight for survival, people tend to cling to information that serves their own interests, no matter how fragile it may be. This wasn't cold-heartedness. It was simply human instinct when resources are scarce beyond measure. Yuxiu slipped sleeping pills into a glass of milk to sedate the child, fearing his cries would give them away. She tucked him into a bundle and covered him carefully with clothes. As they prepared to leave, Old Jin noticed that Ito, lying on the floor, seemed to stir. He grabbed a knife and approached cautiously. But no sooner had he gotten close than Ito suddenly rolled over and lunged at him. Old Jin fought back with a metal rack as Ah Chang took the chance to set all the negatives on fire. Watching his life's work go up in flames, Ito lost his mind and charged into the blaze, desperate to save the photos. Ah Chang only stoked the fire higher. Ito grew even more frantic, obsessed with retrieving those negatives at any cost. Then Ah Chang urged the others to run. The Japanese army's alarm had suddenly blared to life, and a large contingent of troops was closing in.
走啊！别走啊！别走啊！走！
The firelight cast long shadows as Ah Chang made his choice. He would stay behind. He turned and walked straight into the inferno. He knew there was no truly safe place left in Nanjing. Old Jin and Yuxiu reached the checkpoint smoothly and showed the exit passes to the soldiers. The guards searched their bundles but found no trace of the child. They let out a sigh of relief, ready to leave, until they passed near the military dogs, and the child in the bundle suddenly began to cry. The Japanese soldiers shouted orders for them to stop. In a split second, Old Jin thrust the bundle into Yuxiu's arms. He turned and ran back toward the soldiers to buy her time, urging her to keep going. Yuxiu made it to the safety zone, but Old Jin was gunned down by the Japanese troops. The sound of gunfire shattered the air. Yuxiu collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Then she swallowed her grief and walked into the safety zone. She pulled out the photo and asked about Old Jin's wife and daughter, only to learn that they had never arrived. She then inquired if she could get in touch with foreign journalists. She had something that would shake the world to its core to hand over to them. Yuxiu handed a stack of negatives to the foreign journalist. He held them up to the light and examined them closely. These were irrefutable proof of the Japanese army's massacre of innocent civilians. He vowed to expose these hellish images to the world. Before long, the Japanese army's atrocities in Nanjing made headlines in newspapers across the globe, shocking the entire world. More photos from various sources emerged one after another, all exposing the unspeakable cruelty of the Japanese invaders. This inhumane massacre had lasted for weeks. Its victims included not only prisoners of war, but also countless unarmed civilians. Overseas Chinese from all corners of the world took to the streets, protesting the Japanese army's barbaric acts and voicing their support for their motherland. When Ito saw the photos he had taken splashed across the front pages of newspapers as evidence of war crimes, he stared in stunned disbelief. In the end, he was executed by the Japanese military's own warlords. The truth was that the people from the photo studio had secretly swapped a large number of negatives long ago, sewing them into the linings of their clothes. They had made a pact. Whoever survived and escaped would take these pieces of evidence out into the world, to let the truth be known and tear off the invaders' hypocritical masks. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. On September 2nd of the same year, it formally signed the Instrument of Surrender. China's war of resistance against Japanese aggression had achieved a final, hard-won victory. In 1947, the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal opened its sessions. Japanese military officers who had condoned their troops' atrocities in Nanjing were listed as war criminals. In court, they flatly denied the massacre, dismissing it as nothing more than accidental casualties. They even had the audacity to argue that if the Chinese army had surrendered sooner, no civilians would have been harmed. The tribunal immediately presented the irrefutable evidence: the photos of Japanese soldiers torturing and killing civilians that Yuxiu had risked her life to bring out. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no room for denial. After the fall of Nanjing, Japanese military officers had jointly ordered their troops to carry out the mass slaughter. The number of victims exceeded 300,000. The heinous war criminals were sentenced to death on the spot. On April 26, 1947, war criminals like Hisao Tani were taken one by one to the execution ground, with their crimes displayed alongside them. Among the crowds watching from outside the execution site were many relatives of the victims. Old Jin's son was there too, having come specially to witness the delivery of justice. Yuxiu raised her camera and captured the moment the war criminals were executed. She was a survivor of that massacre, and she was also someone who would send this trial to the future. Yet the deaths of these war criminals were far from enough to comfort the spirits of the 300,000 victims of Nanjing. The pain behind those 300,000 lives lost can never be erased by a few gunshots.